Welcome to Salesforce Bite Size. In this video, we'll go over OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow for server-to-server integration and show how it's used for inbound communication with a Salesforce instance. Before we jump into the org and start configuring things, let's quickly recap what is OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow and how it is useful. Let's say you are building a server to server integration where one server needs to access another server's API without needing to involve a user in the authentication process. For example, an e commerce application needs to call Salesforce API to retrieve product information. But how will Salesforce know that it's really the e commerce application making the request and not some malicious attacker? This is where the client credential flow comes in. It allows the client to authenticate itself to Salesforce using a set of client credentials, which typically include a client ID and a client secret. To use the client credentials flow, you first need to register a client by creating a connected app in Salesforce. The connected app will generate a client ID and a client secret, which will be used by the client to authenticate into Salesforce. The connected app also defines which actions the client is allowed to perform by defining scopes. Once the connected app is created, the client needs to make a request to Salesforce token endpoint, which will validate the client credentials, which are the client ID and the client secret. Once the client credentials are validated, a response will be returned with an access token. This access token is like a temporary key that allows the client to access Salesforce APIs to perform actions such as retrieving data. This token typically has a limited lifespan, so the client will need to refresh it periodically to maintain access. Now that the client has the access token, it can be used to access Salesforce APIs on behalf of itself, and the API will respond with the requested data. Now that we have an understanding of how OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow for server-to-server integration works, let's jump into the org and set it up using Postman and Salesforce.
First, we need to create a connected app by going to App Manager and creating a new connected app. Then enter the basic information for the connected app. Enable OAuth settings, filling the callback URL, which can be anything as is not needed for the client credentials flow. Select the scope for the connected app. Enable client credentials. And press Save. Now that the connected app is created, we need to select which user the connected app should run as by pressing Manage, Edit Policies, Run As, choose Integration User, and pressing Save. Next, we need to copy the org's custom domain by navigating to Custom Domain and copying it. Now that we have the custom domain, we can use it in Postman to call Salesforce APIs. First, we need to get the access token by selecting authorization type as OAuth 2.0, grant type as client credentials, access token URL as https://mydomain +/services/OAuth2/token. Then find the client ID and client secret by going to App Manager, selecting our connected app, and pressing Manage Consumer Details. You might get prompted to verify your identity, and then you can copy your client ID and client secret. Next, select Client Authentication as Send Credentials in Body and press Get New Access Token. we can see that a new access token was retrieved and added to the headers. Now that we have the access token, we can proceed to call in the Salesforce API by changing the request type to GET and entering the endpoint to retrieve account information. Find an account ID by navigating to Accounts, selecting an account, and copying the record ID from the browser address bar and pasting it at the end of the endpoint in Postman, and pressing Send. By looking at the response, we can see that our request was not successful. This issue can happen with Postman, but it can be fixed by going to Settings and enabling Follow Authorization Header. Now when we press Send, we can see that we were able to successfully retrieve the account.